Welcome to the Liberty Mindset. Come and explore some of the ideas and issues facing our liberty. 2022 is an election year. As libertarians, we ask that you consider voting in the Liberty Mindset. Welcome, and thank you for your time. Welcome to Liberty Mindset. Jimmy and I invite you to come and continue our curiosity. We're in Washington County, Oregon, and we get together and talk about liberty and share our thoughts on things pertaining to liberty. The goal being to come into a liberty mindset. Today's discussion is on two members of our Bill of Rights, the Third and Fourth Amendments. These domicile amendments are where we often point to, showing an assumption of privacy. Today, we also have a special guest. Marion is a libertarian from Multnomah County. Marion, would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. My name's Marion Skinner. My background, I guess my education's in music theory, music education, and I did a little bit of women's studies in there just to complete my indoctrination. So predictably, my professional background is in retail, restaurant management, and I left the workforce in 2019. I also left social media use at that time, and for a little while, I even took internet out of my house completely. I did that to focus on parenting and to leave my career that I wasn't happy with at all. I wanted to focus on self-development, in hopes of maybe starting a new career later on when I was finished raising my kids. During that time, I was able to quiet the noise of being told how to think and feel about all kinds of social issues or political things around me, and really was able to get in touch with my own value system, and that's really what led me to the Libertarian Party. Getting involved in the Libertarian Party happened as a result of the messaging around the removal of Karen Ann Harlos from her position as secretary, put out by the Mises Caucus mostly. Otherwise, I probably would have just signed up and been a voter. And that was late last year. And my first kind of main action as an active libertarian was to be a voting delegate at the convention in Reno this year in 2022. And I was on the bylaws team for the Mises Caucus, and we ended up not really being able to do anything. We ran out of time at the convention to do anything with that work, but it was a great experience, and I adore everybody who's on that team. And currently, I am working on starting an affiliate for Multnomah County, which is where Portland, Oregon is, and that's where I live now.
Nice.
Wonderful
well, thank you very much, and for all your service within the Libertarian Party. Actually, an unkept secret of this podcast is the reason I even started it was just to get awareness up in hope of starting a chapter here in Washington County. Mm-hmm. That is kind of our purpose. We've had several meetings where people don't show up. You need X number of people to start a chapter. I think the number is 14. Mm-hmm. To be, to come play and sign up and to be part of the committee. And people, we were always at 7 or 8 or 9 or 10. And, so after struggling to try to recruit people for that, I decided, let's just start a podcast, and Jimmy decided to come play with me. And I'm grateful for that. So cool. That is a very good introduction. Jimmy, how was your week? Is there anything you want to start off with before we
I think we're good. I don't think we have any sort of amendments from last time. It's been crazy busy like usual, but we love it.
Well, our last episode was on the Second Amendment, which again is under attack.
Yeah, always is under attack.
Yeah,
as always.
Because we just had a huge. Don't know. For those who don't know, there was a huge court case about in New York State saying that their method of regulating concealed weapons permits was unconstitutional. In the Justice Thomas wrote a beautiful, eloquent, our part on that, good decision on that, and why it was so important to allow people to carry. And it was a treatise on self-defense. It really was. It was really quite good. But that's not the purpose that I'm talking about here. Is the fact that our Congress has now come up with yet another assault weapon ban. Mm-hmm. And they've defined assault weapon in such a broad sense, it literally stops every single firearm from being produced except for maybe lever action rifles and single shot muskets. The lever action could be debatable, whether or not it stops that or not. And those are not exactly considered modern technology. I personally would love to own one for my own personal use and self-defense, but it's like, it's not considered a modern rifle. But anyway,
No.
that's not the issue here. Today we're talking about the Third and Fourth Amendments. And no soldier, the Third Amendment, shall in time of peace be quartered in a house without the consent of the owner, nor in a time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. I think we should be quartering soldiers everywhere in everybody's houses. What do you think?
It's one of those
And
things,
when
like,
possible, the pubs as well.
Yes,
yeah.
the pubs.
Yeah, don't forget
And the
don't forget the
restaurants.
public houses, and yeah, sure.
Cafes, coffee shops.
Those all would have been considered public
Parks.
houses. Yeah.
I mean, the parks definitely were.
Oh yeah, because the Boston Massacre was not a problem because the poor guys were sleeping in the cold winter in the parks.
Right, and you're dying from frostbite and getting gangrene toes and stuff and stuff.
Yeah,
it's good. Oh yeah, it's good for them too. Why not?
So what do we think? And I don't really expect a lot of discussion on the Third Amendment. I did some research and found there have been cases of people say this is a violation of my Third Amendment right. And in every case I've seen, two things were true. A, the judges said, no, it's not. And the second thing was quartering soldiers is not the same as being served a warrant for a search and seizure.
That's very different, yeah.
Yeah, and what a lot of the arguments were from most of the cases I found were the police broke into my house, therefore they were being quartered. And hence it was a violation of my Third Amendment right.
So they don't understand the fact that being quartered is to like house, not like to actually have them staying there for an extended period of time, not just.
And it makes me wonder about the lawyers that wrote this stuff up, because if I'm a lawyer, and I would understand the difference between quartered and being in a raid.
Right. It seems like it was a stretch probably on the lawyer's part to try and go with that.
Marion, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that the only way it could possibly be relevant now is maybe if we wanted to say that quartering is also providing for their needs, basically paying for, and I mean, we are all being forced to pay for all of that, and then some. So, but I think that we'd be hard pressed to squeeze that out of the word actual using the word quartering, because they would have chosen something else if they meant paid for at large.
Yeah.
Right. Taxation or something.
Yeah. Well, and especially because the Quartering Act came out of the Mutiny Act from, common law. And so that would be, obviously the reason was kind of to keep your standing army as part of the people and not, having them stuck together in a place where they could potentially become mutinous.
Meaning keeping the soldiers inside the community so that they had a desire to protect that community, make them part of the community versus.
Yeah. I mean, that's
and that seemed to be the intent behind the Mutiny Act. Absolutely. The Quartering Act, there's have been several, and the Quartering Act of 1765. To me, what little research I could do, and then it was really interesting because the Quartering Act of 1765 was specifically in New York, the colony of New York, and it was related to the French and Indian Wars. And part of me wonders how much of that was just because they couldn't get their guys back.
Yeah.
And
the way to get out,
or they thought we can't trust the Indians, so we need to keep soldiers there, which makes a certain amount of sense. Absolutely.
That's interesting.
But also, that in particular act was directed at public houses and other non-private residencies, and in theory they were supposed to be compensated. Now we know the Crown was famous for not compensating. That's one thing. And then the next act, the 1774 Quartering Act, was actually for all the colonies. And that's because by this time the colonies were starting to get rambunctious. They'd overthrown the Stamp Act. Boston Massacre had occurred. And it was looking like they were going to have to put down unrest in the colonies. And again, though the Quartering Act technically wasn't designed to be shoved into people's houses as much, was there ever an abuse that didn't go unused by a soldier of any army?
Right.
The Quartering Act, we're going to use your house to,
Didn't it also include that they had to, in some instances, had to feed the soldiers too, and like house them as their own?
Oh, well, yeah, that was part of the
situations.
deal. Is when you were in the Quartering Act, you had to take care of the soldiers.
Like they're your family and all this, and if you don't have the means for it, that means your family might starve while the soldiers eat. I mean, depends on the soldier and the person that's in there and their general disposition on how that would go. So you'd never really know if you're going to have a soldier there that is, kind and nice, or if you're going to get somebody who's going to secretly listen to what you're saying and report it back to the crown.
And people don't realize that America of the colonial era is not the America we have today. This amazing fact that we have so much in this country. Most of us in Americans don't realize how much more we have than everybody else.
Yeah, freedom being one of the biggest things.
Well, I think being the cause, but we can get into that too. But anyway, but I really think that they were subsistence farmers for the most part. Everybody farmed their own food for the most part. Everybody, and you didn't have acres and acres of land to be able to suddenly double the size of your family.
Right.
And
you couldn't just get more cattle. You couldn't just get more chickens.
Bartering was normal. Bartering was normal. You swap things around for things you needed. You didn't swap things around for money. It's not like you had it was the rich person was the exception in the colonies.
Right.
Where in this, and I come at this from a sort of a world traveler perspective, having lived in a third world country. And sometimes we may have a long definition of what wealth is, because I think we get it all wrong. But
yeah.
I lived in a third world country in Lesotho, Africa for a couple of years, and when I was 18, and it was amazing what you had to learn to do without. And that included running water and power that was regular, and all the things that we take for granted here.
Right.
But interestingly enough, so none of us have a thing against the whole idea of the Third Amendment. We think that's a good idea. Is that what I'm saying? We have agreement on that?
I'd say so. I mean,
yeah.
I feel like if somebody wants to house soldiers in their home during a time of war, if we were ever to have another civil war or something, that's the prerogative of that person and those families. But
don't forget the last part of the amendment, but in a manner as prescribed by law.
Yeah.
The Congress can still enact a law that would force you to have soldiers in this. To me, that is the big danger.
Yeah.
And our current Congress, and has been this way for a long time, doesn't write laws anymore. They write ideas, and then they throw them to the administration to figure out the rules.
Right.
And I think that's a huge problem, because that means that this faceless administration is, the one's responsible.
And they're throwing around ideas right and left, and half of them are still sitting on someone's desk. But that's a whole nother topic.
Yeah, that's true. It is a whole nother topic. Yeah. Okay. How about the Fourth Amendment?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
No. You're about to say something. I'm not going to stop you.
The only thing I was going to say, is if that were to be removed, but in a manner as prescribed by law, that's where your loophole would exist for. Well, then why do we have to pay to quarter them all the time? That's probably where it resides. If it needed to defend itself, it would reside there.
Well, I don't think the Articles of Confederation didn't have a standing army, period.
Right.
That was something that came around later. And I'm at a bit of a quandary. I don't disagree. We need some sort of standing force, but I also think that just because the world now, back in it took months to get a weeks to, or at least a week to get across the ocean when we finally got even steamships, right? It took you a week to get across the ocean, so things just weren't as fast. But now it takes us hours to get around the planet, and they can pre-position ships now that can stay out to sea forever. And we have aircraft and things that make the projection of power a completely different concept than what they used to have. Because before it was all about the number of people you had and the number of barrels you had attached to those people, guns being the barrels I'm talking about. And so you just overwhelmed an entity. It wasn't even about training. It was just about throwing things at the enemy until they broke. Now we have a highly trained professional service in our military that
psychological warfare and everything
well,
else
and
to boot.
psychological warfare and just more effective. A single soldier now is much more effective than a platoon in the revolutionary days. It's just one single soldier carries more ammunition than an entire platoon would carry anymore. Used to carry.
Right. And I mean, they're trained now as opposed to, it was just, half the time it was farmers, who got together and did a few rounds to figure out how to use the musket. And there you go.
That's right. Or, your hunting skills, but that's beside the point.
Yeah.
So that is something we need to worry about only in the fact that with our current political situation in this country, that's something that is concerning to me because they talk about a peaceful national divorce and I just, guess what? The first Civil War was fought after a peaceful civil divorce. So that I hate that phrase because I've never known a peaceful civil divorce anywhere among individuals, among countries, among populations. It just
it's an oxymoron.
Yeah, and it's part of what's kept me married for 35 years. So let's move on to the Fourth Amendment. I'm sure she's listening and going, you jerk. Anyway, I'm the only reason I married you is because I didn't want to get a divorce. Yeah, right. That's not what I meant. Anyway, the right of the people to secure in their persons and houses papers and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue upon probable cause supported by oath, affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons and things to be seized. I expect some heavy discussion on this.
Yes.
There's a lot there.
It's a big one to chew on.
It sounds great.
In theory. It sounds like it's great in theory.
It sounds
we
good.
can poke a lot of holes in this.
Yes.
What do you mean holes? Go.
You can't really look at this. You can't look at this without also looking at, the 12 doctrines that go along with it based on Supreme Court decisions.
Okay. You're going to share those 12 doctrines? You're just going to throw that out there?
Well, I don't know. I'm going to throw it out. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I don't know if it's 12, but you've got plain view, obviously, consent, exigent circumstances, or hot pursuit, right? We've talked about hot pursuit, I think, a little bit. And community caretaker. I believe that's when someone's having a heart attack and you search their bag for the pills, right? When
or
you're
search for an EpiPen if they're
something
having if they're having allergic reactions or a thing. Yeah.
Right. They're not looking for a criminal stuff.
Or they find methamphetamine in your purse or something.
Right.
How embarrassing.
But of course the bigger ones would be like Terry stop and search.
Big cases like Breonna Taylor's case.
Oh yes, yeah. No, not
don't just drop Breonna Taylor. Go ahead and tell us what it is.
So
not everybody's going to know what the Breonna Taylor case is.
Breonna Taylor's a 26-year-old African American woman who was shot during a no-knock raid in her home and killed. General thing here on Wikipedia says that when at least 7 police officers forced entry into the apartment as part of an investigation into drug dealing operations. So they had been watching this house. They decided to do a no-knock raid. And this was in Louisville, Kentucky. And it's still not resolved.
People have heard the phrase, say her name.
Yep.
And that's the root of this case. What also is interesting about that, from what I understand, the boyfriend shot back through the door and actually was acquitted of any wrongdoing.
Yeah.
Which is,
And yeah, no knock raids. It's a huge hot button for this amendment.
well, and I've known police officers, and I can't imagine. A friend of mine is a recovering police officer. I used to say retired, but he went back to work recently. And so maybe he's not recovering, but
I think they all end up going back to work in some level like that. But my grandfather's retired.
yeah, my friend had a certain set of skills that this organization needed, and so he ran out of retirement, and plus he's paying for an airplane. So
All right, rock on.
his dream. Yeah, well, I mean, it was his dream when he was 13, and I literally have known him since he was 12 or 13. So it's not like
that's awesome.
But anyway, I talked to him about this case, and one of the things he said is they would have handled it completely different because the no-knock warrant is the worst possible way you could handle it.
Yes.
They knew where Brianna worked. They knew where, they didn't necessarily know about the boyfriend at the time in the house, but had they handled it where they intercepted Brianna on the way home from work or something, and then went into her house with a warrant, the whole thing could have been avoided, and who knows what they would have found. That's not my call. I don't understand. I don't know if they ever even found any drugs in her house. I don't think they did.
And how many cops' lives are these knock raids putting on the line?
Yeah, there was a cop who
that's a big thing.
Got shot in his leg and almost died because he was lucky not to get died. You're
lucky if you have a normal warrant and don't get shot. I'm sure in situations like this where you actually do introduce who you are and everything, but when people do a no-knock raid, I mean, everybody involved is basically at risk of being killed, especially in these situations.
I think there's a time and a place, but again, you have to have extraordinary circumstances for those uses. And my friend has served a number of warrants, and he talks about whether they decide to go in hot, as he calls it.
Yeah.
And the decision is based on the reputation of the player or the person they're going after, and if they're known to be exceedingly armed and exceedingly violent, then guess what? It's the safest way to do it. But in her case, in Brianna's case, it wasn't that way.
Yeah.
So, I have a real thing, and the interesting thing is securing their house and persons and papers and effects. And one of the things people keep talking about is a right to privacy. So I want to kind of throw that out here. We live in a digital world.
I don't think there's such thing as privacy anymore.
Well, and I don't disagree with you to an extent. I mean, you will find that if you Google my name, you will find lots of stuff out there. And if you Google my one handle that I use, I've used a handle called USP Sure Shot, all one word, for 20 years. And it is, if you Google it, you will find that it's attached to Gregor Hinckley. And there's a reason for that, because I have a real thing against, I am all for privacy. I am all against anonymity.
Yeah. I like transparency.
I really think that I should be responsible for my actions. So I have always made it clear that my real name is Gregor Hinckley, and, USP Sure Shot is a handle I've used around the world. But you could attach the two, because I'm not going to say I'm not going to say anything that I want to hide from. And good or bad or indifferent, that's just the way I think, because I figure if I'm willing to put up with the consequences, then I'm going to be more careful for what I say.
Yeah, be more aware of what you do.
But the question is, do we have an actual right to privacy? The problem being is that our electronic signals go out over a public network, and therein lies the hard part is that all that information is out there for everybody to see if you know how to get it. Somebody can find my phone easily enough if they have the right tools. The police don't even need a warrant for it. There's subscription services that they can subscribe to that will track your phone and tell you where you're at. No warrant needed. They can just say, that's, here's a guy, let's look him up on this database and see where he is right now.
Well, and if there was a second Gregor Hinckley being sought after for a crime, they may decide to ping you instead,
The joys of having a unique first name.
Yes.
There's not a lot of Gregor. There are other Gregor Hinckleys out there. There are. But from what I can tell, most of us are nice guys, because I've never had a knock on the door.
Most people with my name are male, with not Jimmy, but Jamesy. And so it's a rare one. Unique names are good though.
Yes, but unique names are good. But what do you think about privacy? Where in our modern world, where do we have to strive for it?
I think this one really struggle with. It's pretty open and shut for me in terms of property. Like, even I find the open fields doctrine to be, wildly unconstitutional reading of this, which would mean that, like, basically a government agent could put surveillance or be on your land if it's outside your, they call it the curtilage, which is basically from your house to your fence. So it's got your yard and maybe a couple outbuildings on it. And that's the reasonable area that they call your home or your house. And I think I don't agree with that at all. Most states, and they have written it out their constitutions. But the problem is that, like, the main problem with sending your signals out across a network, like I said before, is we don't understand the network. User doesn't have the ability to protect their privacy, to take ownership and responsibility of protecting their privacy.
Yeah.
You can trust a VPN, pay $10 a month, or there are all kinds of ways that you can try to protect your privacy, but there's really no way for each one of us to take that by the reins. And so it's that way that I don't think it's all right for the government to collect our phone records, just at large, even though they're out there for collection. They're
Mhm.
off
Doesn't
my
mean they should do
property.
it.
Um,
Yeah,
it
for those who
doesn't,
might not be
right? It
totally
doesn't
familiar with a
mean that.
VPN, some people may not know what a VPN is, or they may say, well, I heard about that. What does it mean? Or they think that it's all that, it is the spades of security. A VPN just means that the information is put through a public IP address that is not assigned to you. The
Bounces
information is still
around.
put out there.
Yeah.
There's very few things that have end-to-end, what they call end-to-end encryption, where it's encrypted on my computer, stays encrypted until it gets on the other person's computer, and therefore in between it's private. I used to work for a company called Qualcomm, and one of the things that we had issues with was the government was constantly trying to get us to build into our chips a backdoor so they could decrypt the data, because there's an old technology called CDMA. I mean, it's been around, literally been around since the 30s. And it became famous in the 40s from a actress named Hedy Lamarr, of all people, who helped develop it. Strangely enough, she was a brilliant
If she was.
but we encrypt the Qualcomm encrypts the data from the phone to the tower, and according to law, anything that's transmitted via radio is open public source. And for years, telephones didn't use that. They just used plain simple radio signals, and you could, with a receiver that could receive that signal, listen on everybody's conversations. Where with CDMA, it's encrypted, but it's only encrypted to the tower, and it's not encrypted in route between the towers. So the government listens onto the towers, they listen between the towers, and they wanted to have access to the actual live stuff so they could hear it before they had to go through all the shenanigans to get it. They wanted to hear it from the source, and Qualcomm never acquiesced, to my knowledge. They may have it after I left, but to my knowledge, it never acquiesced because it just was not something they thought they needed to do. But that's the thing about encryption and about VPNs, is they will anonymize your data, but they will not eliminate it from being seen.
Right. And there are platforms in which you can have things encrypted on both ends. Sure, you have to do your research on it.
Yeah, something like
it's
Proton Mail or something else, where you can encrypt it on your computer or send it to somebody else that decrypts from theirs. But if those computers are connected to the internet, it's still almost public information.
Well, it's like growing up on the very tail end of the millennial spectrum. It's interesting because my parents always drilled into my head, if you put it on the internet, it's always going to be there. And I feel like there was some disconnect probably in the early 2000s to 2010, where I started seeing people posting and just doing all sorts of absolutely absurd stuff that I would never want on the internet. Because, you know, say this young Joe Smith posts pictures of him doing illicit things, and then 30 years from now he wants to run or for a political party, it comes back to bite him in the butt.
And we've seen that.
Yeah, and it's like there's this disconnect. Like people stopped realizing, oh yeah, basically if it goes on the internet, it's out there somewhere. It can be found somehow. It doesn't ever go away. We don't know how to make it actually go away at this point, and we didn't back then when it started out.
Yeah.
So I mean, the concept of privacy in, you know, when we look at how we live today, there's not a whole lot of it. And that's why I think people cling to what privacy they can maintain as much as they do. I mean, I stepped down and back from social media, 2016, 2017, and then kind of bounced back in here and there just to say hi or use the messaging platforms. But there's no need for it. But it also is a place where you lose a lot of privacy. People check into where they're at. People, you know, tweet that they're at this restaurant, or that they take a picture of their food at this restaurant. I mean, you can follow people just as like a mundane, you know, person. You could follow somebody around based upon what they do on social media and find out exactly where they are because of what they post. And people do it without thinking about any possible repercussions that could amount from that.
Yeah. Marion, go. I see your face moving. Go.
Yeah, I think this gets a little bit, I think it gets a little bit into like the trouble with the wording of this amendment is that it kind of relies on our you know, society's current reasonable expectation of privacy. And that's anybody can tell you that's not a good law writing.
No.
Well, you know, there's
and that's where, you know, whoever's in control of the narrative is the one who gets to say what our reasonable expectations should be.
Yeah. And I'm sort of, I mean, I guess if I was going to be a woke culture person, I could say I'm on two spirits on this one. Because I personally, I mean, I see privacy as your personal responsibility. Okay. Now, let's face it, technology like Alexa, Google, whatever, very handy to have. People are turning off their lights, turning on their TV, doing all kinds of things with it. You know, it can be very nice to have this technology. It's just that all your information is out there. Now, you know, for the things that people got in trouble with for posting 25 years ago, to me, I like looking at that only because when I talk about what they posted, right? My question becomes, why on earth did you post that?
Yeah.
And 9 times out of 10, if you talk to them about it, it's, well, because it was just a thing I did. It was anonymous post. It was no big deal.
Or I was a dumb kid.
I was a dumb kid.
Yeah.
But whatever it boiled down to, it was I did not care about the consequences at the time. And therefore, they end up getting in trouble.
There's your consequence, which just happened 25 years later.
Yeah, well, and
right.
And I think that's a, you know, that is a chronic problem with our current society. I was I'm the very tail end of the boomer administration, right? The boomer world, which is the product of the World War II veterans and the folks that went through that. They came home, had babies, and we were the boomers.
The boomer population.
Yeah, well, and you know, my father, he didn't. I don't know anything. Well, that's not true. My adopted dad. I don't know anything about my biological dad, but I do know about, you know, my adopted dad. And you know, he wasn't in World War II, but he was in service. You know, he joined the Navy, and he was, you know, and he was, you know, a good citizen and a decent person, and everything I know about him, because he and my mom broke up when I was a child, but I got to know him a little bit later in life, and everything I know about him, he's a good man. I would have been honored to have him around the house. But you know, we run into things where people don't think of the consequences, and then they are shocked when they have them.
Yeah.
Or worse, they don't have them. You know,
I keep doing it.
Well, you know, Marion, my apologies for your attorney, your district attorney in Multnomah County. You know, he's quite the challenge for you, I would imagine, because he seems to believe that there is no rule of law at all.
Yeah.
Nobody said no to
Yeah.
him firmly enough for him to realize it.
Well, and
Yeah.
they
Well,
we had
and
2 years of riots in Portland, and what happened to the folks that were involved in that?
Yeah,
Literally
where's
nothing.
the,
right.
yeah, yeah.
And he did that on
Yeah.
purpose.
Even viewing the Portland riots situation from like an anarchist perspective, which is I'm a little bit more on the non-government intervention
Hmm.
at all costs kind
Okay.
of mind, but I do come from law enforcement background as
Mhm.
well, from in my family, so it's I'm not that far removed as well, um, and I had a super benevolent police officer for a father, so
Mm,
it
mm.
took well into my adult life to understand um, how maybe the police aren't exactly the solution that we need
Yeah.
at this time, but
There's a
when
time
you
and
look
place
at
for
the
him.
Portland riots aspect, from my perspective, is that if no one's prosecuting crime or holding people accountable for crime, or even just holding them while they're dangerous to the public,
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, why am I being prevented from taking action on these fronts as well?
And that
There
is,
are many kinds of things I'm not allowed to do to protect my own home, my
Right.
space, my sanctity, my quiet,
Well, it's anytime
my
there's a
children's
chance to do
access.
a riot, there are groups of people who find this like a wonderful time to break people's stuff. And anytime we have any really big hoopla, like recently the abortion overthrow of Roe versus Wade, it's like people started breaking windows of people's cars in Portland. And it's like, why would you break the windows of someone's car you don't even know? And now this person has to pay for it out of pocket to fix when they're already struggling probably with everything else. And it's just, it gets a little out of hand, and you expect the prosecutors and everybody to just kind of step in and say, hey, let's try and make this right. And it feels like things have stagnated in Portland on that
well,
front.
to Marion's point, and your point too,
Mhm.
to an extent, but mostly to Marion's point, the idea that if you do something, what happens?
Mhm.
There have been people that tried to defend their homes in Portland and were arrested for it. There,
Right.
you know,
Mhm.
and there were people that were defending themselves and were highly persecuted for it.
Yeah.
And and so it becomes a rule for thee and not for me kind of situation where um, the bad actors get carte blanche, and the people that believe in a civil and in structure, and not even as structured so much as structured, but peaceful society.
Mhm.
Because Michael Malice is one of my favorite writers, and he's a crazy anarchist as far as I'm in many firm ways, right? His
Mhm.
firm belief is that we do not need government,
Mhm.
period. Now I'm a little more traditional in the fact that I think we have to have a certain amount of rules to guide us. I think what we have is far beyond what the founding fathers ever imagined.
Yes.
And I think, Roe v. Wade being a perfect example where the decision was that in the current case, I forgot was it the Georgia abortion case that brought forth the Roe v. Wade decision.
Mhm.
The
Dobbs, was it
decision
Dobbs?
the
Yeah, I think so.
decision is that the government has no say.
Right.
It's not that they overturned the use of abortion.
It's
It is
just it's
just
not
the
there.
government has no horse in this fight. Doesn't have a dog in this fight, and
Mhm.
so we can't tell you what to do, and left it up to the states, which is where it always should have been.
Right. I mean, we should be more like little countries all band together under one
Well,
unity,
and
but
what effect did that Roe v. Wade decision have on Oregon? None.
none. We are still the same, and we will
We are
probably
still the
always
same,
be
and
the
we will
same.
become a sanctuary state for abortion, and we will
Yep,
have people coming from
all
I
sorts of
don't know
places.
where to have
Yeah,
Up
abortions
until birth.
here.
yeah.
Is it legal up till birth here? I haven't looked
Yes.
into
I think Washington might be up
which
until
we
third
can talk
trimester.
about that, and that's as a right wing, well, not right wing, probably right wing. Anyway, as a Christian white straight male, we can talk about the whole up until birth thing.
Mhm.
I'm a little bit in oddities that abortion. People don't realize abortion is not new.
No,
The
they're not.
first writings on it were by Hippocrates back
Mhm.
3,500 years ago. So it's not like it's a new thing.
I mean,
Um,
women knew about all sorts of like herbs and things that you could take to stop,
Well, and
to basically cause your
even the
body to
performance
rid
of
it.
even a performance of a prophagia surgical abortion, Hippocrates knew how to do it. He just wrote that it's not worth the risk.
Mhm.
His point was, yes, we can do this, but the risk of infection was so high that, it was safer to let the woman finish the term
Mhm.
and then destroy the child, which he didn't seem to have any problems with, right? And, we know that the Greek and Roman cultures had no problems with it because of archaeological finds,
Yeah,
and
sewers.
and as a Christian, it's like I hate the idea, granted, but I'm also smart enough to know that if you make something illegal, you just make it worse. And so
Prohibition
I'm never
solves
gonna,
nothing.
I'm never gonna support a law that says you can't do abortion. Now, I also think that abortions, some of the, like we talked about late term abortion, Fourth Amendment to late term abortions, I love it. But we talk about late term abortions, and now I have to question. My question is not whether or not it's morally wrong, because in my book it is, but the next question is it safe? The later you go, there comes a point where a cesarean might be safer than an abortion,
It
right?
depends on what's at risk. If the mother's life is at risk to continue to full term, then
Well,
that's a
and
reason.
absolutely,
Yeah.
and if you want to talk about, if here's my thing: if it's a choice between the woman's life and the baby's life, it ain't my business.
Yeah.
Period.
It's up to
Okay,
them and the doctors.
it's between them and God, and I'm not involved. Right? I can't. The doctors, I will never ever tell a woman she can't do whatever needs to be done to save her life.
Mhm.
I
But the
think
question,
that's the most particularly relevant point there
Yeah.
is that
Mhm.
is that not about who should have an abortion and when or when not and
Yeah.
what happens, but whose job is it to say, like, who should
Right.
butt out of this situation, which is the whole reason for the Bill of Rights, for these amendments
Right.
in the first place, is to tell us where the government does not belong.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I mean, the
And I,
They don't
government,
belong in your house.
they don't belong in between us and
They
a
don't.
doctor.
That's
which brings
exactly
us to all
right.
the other stuff, gay marriage and all those other things, which
Mhm.
it's funny that we talk about the federal government getting involved in gay marriage, because there's no place in the Constitution where marriage is under their auspices, period.
Yeah.
And the original
Right.
marriage licenses were issued to keep Black people from marrying white people.
Right.
That was the
And yet we
purpose of a
still
marriage
have them.
license.
Well, now
So
they're
I
there
love,
to enforce tax codes.
yeah.
Right. But
Well, and those have been changing, even like when they stopped making it so you could claim your children. Like a lot of those tax codes aren't even relevant as much anymore, and which is making the marriage license even less relevant. And people
right.
aren't wanting to do it. They don't want to be tracked. They don't want to be traced through this. They don't want to be taxed through this. They don't want to, look at it from that perspective. They would just rather be with the person they love and have it be that.
Well, and my thing is, I know people have a thing about the word marriage. And I know there's a lot of folks who claim to be Christian that say that, marriage is between a man and a woman and God, but there's, I don't disagree with that, to be honest, but the word marriage is a 12th century term. It's not an
Mhm.
ancient term. It comes from the French,
Yep.
and it's, all about a blending of families, and it was used only exclusively for kings and princes to be married to, and queens to be married to each other, in order to, have contracts of civility, in order
Yeah,
to keep
political.
from going to war,
Yeah, for
and
political movements.
so, you take, marry, fine, I'm okay with calling it a civil union, and as long as your partner, and I use that term in the sense that whatever you choose, that's between you and yourself and the other person, and I'm not going to stop you. Do I agree with your lifestyle? No, it's not my job to agree or disagree with it. It's my job to treat you as a decent human being and move on.
Yeah,
Call me crazy, but that's just the way I work.
and that's
Now,
very
if you want
Sounds like a
progressive.
to,
libertarian.
I
Yeah,
know.
you
Well, see,
do.
I know I'm crazy, but
If you're
and
crazy, we're all crazy.
but and it is a very, I mean, granted, it's a libertarian mindset, but I mean, that's one I've had. I was a Republican in California. And when I came to Oregon, I finally decided I was through supporting that party, even though I have my challenges with the Libertarian Party as well.
I was a Democrat in Washington, so we come from two sides there.
There you go. No wonder we work so interestingly together. But so yeah, I have my challenges with the Libertarian Party as well. But it also there are principles in the Libertarian Party that most people consider sacrosanct, which is something that I can get behind. Where the other two major parties don't seem to have any principle at all. And it's becoming more and more apparent that if you vote for the Republicans or you vote for the Democrats, you're getting the same piles. Some of them
basically the opposite end of the horseshoe. We're getting to a circle point where they're so similar.
Yeah, they're both so similar that I don't see a lot of change. I mean, 14 Republicans joined into what I consider a Fourth Amendment, or a fifth, actually probably a Sixth Amendment violation under red flag laws, right? Because they're taking things away from you without any kind of due process. And I'm not saying that we should allow every crazy person on the planet to own firearms, but you know what? You need a process in order to take away a person's rights, if we're going to have a civil society. Now, in an uncivil society, you just cap the bastards and you have the crazy ones, and you're done with it. So there's the question of what do you want? You want a civil society? You want an uncivil society?
Well, and it's interesting, like talking about red flag laws and things like that, and all this, the gun laws and search and seizure. You look at the amount of gun deaths on, let's say, the West Coast, and then you look at Texas, who now is open carry, constitutional carry rather. The statistics aren't any different on the rates half the time. I mean, you still see that people are still polite and they're nice to each other. They're not like running around paranoid, everybody's going to shoot them. But if you grow up, like I grew up in Washington thinking that, raised in a mental state that Texas with their ability to just shoot anybody means that everybody's like on edge around each other. But after going there, it's like, that's not how it is. There's a different level of understanding between people. And I feel like that's one of those things people don't understand when they go against certain laws and amendments.
You have to remember that Oregon is considered an open carry state. You do not need to have a license to carry a firearm openly, which means not concealed. Everybody can see it. Unless you're in Multnomah County, congratulations, Marion, in which case you have to have a concealed weapons permit in order to openly carry a weapon. Because I have that straight.
Which makes perfect sense.
Oh, yeah, perfect sense. But I find it fascinating.
We do have fairly good home protection laws, though.
Yeah, and that's true. Oregon's home protection laws are pretty good. If somebody breaks into my house, that's what they have shown intent, and I have a right to defend myself.
So here's a question, and coming from Washington, I'm still new to Oregon in the last couple years, and just jog my memory here. So in Washington, you have to shoot to kill. If somebody invades your home, like if you shoot and you maim them, the person who is maimed or like gets shot in the shoulder and his rotator cuff busts out, and therefore you can't use it again, sort of thing, that person can sue you for it. And it's the most like absurd thing ever. So you have to shoot to kill. If you're some like person in your home and you're being raped, that's probably not what you're going to be thinking of, is where can I kill this person? You're just thinking, how do I get out? How do I stop this? And you run risk of being sued by whoever just broke in your home. And it's a really absurd situation. But how is Oregon on that sort of stance? Like, how do is it just?
Don't know. I would have to look into that one, but I don't remember. I think I would remember if
we are not considered a castle doctrine state.
There you go.
Okay. But we are not also a requirement to retreat state. Okay. So you have to be able to the interesting things about what I understand about Oregon self-defense laws, which is something I delved into heavily as I was moving up here, because I'm a firearms owner, and if you come into my house in a violent manner, you're going to be greeted with, some force. And, though I am old and disabled, I'm not unable. Let's put it that way. So
pull a trigger.
Pardon?
You can still pull a trigger.
I can still do a lot more than that too. But whoever you are, it's not easy. And I am not one of those people that's going to back down. I know I'm not fearful. I've had some experiences in my life where I've proven to myself that I'm not fearful in that regard. So, don't is the answer. Don't. But in Oregon, the laws are very fascinating where if you claim self-defense, it is up to the prosecutor to prove it was not. Okay, which is a very unusual way of looking at
Yeah.
it. But they have to be able to prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that you were not acting in self-defense when you took a life or whatever. Now, professional hint, if you do studying, find classes, take classes online. There's lots of them. There's people like, well, there's all kinds of people that you can get, classes from where we'll talk about specifically your state. But the important thing in Oregon is if you shoot somebody in self-defense, you will be arrested. You will be taken to the police station. That is true in 100% of the states in this nation. Okay. The question is what happens next? And in Oregon, you have to make clear it's self-defense and you have to notify the judge in writing clarify that it has to be in writing that you are claiming self-defense. That's a requirement. If you don't ever do that, then they don't have to try you as a self-defense case. So those are two things to know. If you ever and get arrested in your confession at the top of the confession, I was in fear for my life and this was a case of self-defense. Put that in everything you say that you have to say, because then they have to prove differently. And that is the hard part, because if someone's breaking into my home, it's really hard to prove that it wasn't self-defense.
Right.
So, we don't have a castle doctrine, but we have a doctrine. We have the legal system is structured so that the person who is defending themselves gets the benefit of the doubt.
I was just curious, looping back to the no-knock raids. Apparently, currently, according to the endallnoknocks.org, Oregon and Florida are the only states that prohibit issuing no-knock warrants.
Well, good for us.
So, I mean, that's nice to have a little bit of ease to think that you didn't, the chances are less likely to occur here.
Yeah. So, anything else we want to talk about in Fourth Amendment stuff? No, that's really shocking. So I guess we'll close out. Let me see here. Where was that nifty quote? One of the things I wanted to leave with us, we ran across a nifty quote in our studies. Come on, Jimmy, you even commented on that, and I saw you.
Where'd it go?
Yeah, I saw it earlier today. I was thumbing through the notes.
Yeah, the notes up here.
And
now I'm blind because I'm like, where did it go?
Now I'm blind.
Every word of the Constitution decides a question between power and liberty.
That's right. James Madison. Every word of the Constitution decides a question between power and liberty. And that's something we have lost. If you've been stimulated by our discussion, we invite you to email us at thelibertymindset@gmail.com. Write comments in both at any of our platforms. We get notified when the comments are written, and we'll look into them and we'll share them if they're, written in a decent language. If you're hateful, I'm sorry, I'm going to ignore you. But if you're engaging, then we're all over it, even if you agree with us differently.
We can debate. We can debate.
We can debate. Marion, I'd like to thank you for joining us and let it be known that you're welcome anytime. And Jimmy, I really appreciate your views. And listen, everybody, this election year, remember, with the liberty mindset, it's not what you can do to people, but it's what allowing each of us to do for ourselves. So thank you very much. And don't forget, seek truth and stay curious.
Thank you.